Hello and welcome to Dialogue. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Secretary of State Antony Blinken appealing to China for cooperation on the economy and the Ukraine crisis implies the U.S. wish to rekindle ties with China. How big a difference can these appeals make? And what is the way forward to manage this important yet tense bilateral relationship? To find out, I'm joined today by Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics from the Center for Strategic and International Studies for the first half of the show, and Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, for the second half. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Scott. So recently we have been seeing Washington senior officials, Janet Yellen, Antony Blinken, has been calling for dialogue with Beijing. And so from your point of view, you talked about this kind of calling. You describe them as discordant with the general atmosphere in Washington, Beijing, that the U.S. and China are destined to decouple and fight a war. Tell us why we are seeing these new gestures calling for dialogue, and are we seeing a shift of tone, if not substantive change of U.S. policy on China?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and happy to talk about U.S.-China relations and where we're headed. I think the U.S. has been concerned about the trajectory of U.S.-China relations for quite some time. Having been in Beijing and live and work in Washington, I can tell you that in both places, the sense of fatalism is pretty high. The sense that we're destined for military conflict and economic conflict as well. But I think that there's a strong desire in much of Washington to avoid those really negative outcomes. We've had in fits and starts efforts to resume dialogue, beginning with the meeting of the two presidents in Bali. Of course, that was interrupted by the balloon incident, both the balloon flying over the U.S. and the U.S.'s reaction and some other things. But I think we're just seeing a resumption of that effort, first initiated by the U.S. side to get dialogue going again. We've had some important speeches by the Treasury Secretary, by the National Security Advisor, statements by others in Europe and elsewhere. And I think that there is not only a change in tone, but a change in substance that you can see from these speeches. Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, I think was really clear to highlight that the U.S.'s concerns about national security and human rights in China are real. They're serious. The U.S. won't stop focusing on these issues, but there are boundaries to the U.S.'s focus on national security. It doesn't cover absolutely everything. In addition, the restrictions that the U.S. places with regard to export controls and in other ways are really meant to achieve national security aims, not competitiveness, industrial policy goals. In addition, she highlighted the positive elements that could come out of U.S.-China commercial relations, which is rare for an administration recently to say. And she also focused on the global challenges that the U.S. and China can face, from climate to public health to macroeconomic imbalances. And so I think actually what we've seen is a genuine shift, not just a change in tone, not just window dressing, but significant adjustments in American policy towards China.
Well, Scott, of course, on the Chinese side, there's a concern about the wide use of the concept of national security, or in some other words, like misuse or even abuse of this national security concept, and using that against China, cracking down on the high-tech sector, for example. So, what's your response to that kind of concern?
Well, I can understand that. I mean, both sides have reasons to be concerned about the use of the national security framework for managing the relationship. In China, the word security, 安全, is now put together with many, many adjectives: food security, energy security, economic security, health security. And there's many policies that implement those phrases in that larger framework. You see that in the speeches of the top leadership. You see that applied to specific policies regarding economic information, espionage, et cetera. In the United States, you've seen a proliferation of the attention to national security as well, and applied in a lot of places. I think one of the reasons the U.S. has expanded its application of this idea is that in the high-tech era, where there are a lot of technologies that are inherently dual use, and you have an economy like China's, where the boundaries between the corporate entity and the state are blurry, particularly with policies like civil military fusion, it's really difficult to manage those national security issues entirely separately from economic issues. So I do think that we're seeing the expansion of national security applied in both places. And really, it would be wonderful to have the leaderships of both sides sit down, look at the use or abuse of national security and see if they can identify some boundaries, some common rules of the game. You have Article 21 of the WTO, which is just a couple paragraphs, which really doesn't sufficiently define where the international community has a right to constrain others' attention to national security. So I understand it's a problem. There's a lot that both sides need to talk about to limit the abuse of national security as it applies to our relations.
Scott, you regarded Yellen's speech as a clear differentiation from the approach toward China taken by the previous Trump administration. So you see, how different how different is probably the Biden administration from Trump. For example, some people would say the Biden administration has taken some of the policies probably much harsher than Trump toward China. Or giving this speech and recent appealing for dialogue, does that mean probably the two countries can avoid complete decoupling and to avoid a war?
Well, there's several Trump eras from the previous administration. Very early on, the Trump administration tried to negotiate with China for the first few months, didn't succeed. In its judgment, launched the trade war. Its goal was to use unilateral pressure to push China to make major concessions with the goal of still keeping China integrated in the global community. Then you had and that resulted in the phase one deal. You then had the outbreak of the pandemic. And then you saw a whole series of punitive actions by the Trump administration, not meant as part of a negotiation, but simply as punishment to China. The Biden administration has similar concerns about China that we saw in the Trump administration, but their playbook is quite different. Certainly, they focused heavily on aligning American policies with allies in East Asia and Europe, meant to help defend the liberal international order more broadly conceived. In addition, a huge emphasis on investment in American infrastructure, technology, education, healthcare, which was not a significant part of the Trump administration policy. And then also now emphasis on looking for places to collaborate on global issues. And I think now what you're seeing with this speech by Janet Yellen, as well as the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, an effort to really clarify where the boundaries of what's acceptable and not, being very clear that their goal is not decoupling or even partial decoupling. They're now using the language of the European Union, de-risking. And I think if you look at the data, trade, investment, there's not much decoupling going on. If a full scale relationship was 100, we're maybe at like 97 now. We're not down to 10. There's worries about where the relationship may go. We might have a lot less connectivity, but both sides have an ability to stop this vicious cycle. The Chinese have done a lot of things to restrict the relationship, going way back to the Great Firewall and other restrictions. The U.S. has imposed some, but both sides have the power and the ability to adopt policies to try to provide greater reassurance to the other side, address some of their key concerns, and see if we can have some more optimism instead of some of the fatalism which seems to infect both capitals right now.
Well, Scott, you made a good point. I think people would say it's nice to see and hear the calling for dialogue. But if you look at the action or the real policy from Washington toward Beijing, for example, the Biden administration is going to restrict or ban some of the investment in China. So we are seeing actually further restriction on this bilateral trade and investment sector here. The Chinese side would say, yes, you're talking in a nice way, but you're doing it in a different way. It seems there's a lack of trust from Beijing.
Well, I can't speak for Beijing at all. I can speak for how Americans perceive what's going on in China, and from my conversations of talking to people when I was on the ground in China last fall and in March at the China Development Forum. And yes, I'd say a lack of trust on both sides is quite clear. Both sides have taken a whole variety of steps to restrict the relationship. I think the U.S.'s view is from what I can tell, is that there are types of technologies, the most advanced semiconductors and semiconductor equipment, which could help China militarily. And we have genuine national security issues in the Taiwan Strait and potentially elsewhere. And it's not the U.S.'s job to help China's military become more powerful, as it's not China's job to help the American military become more powerful. And the U.S. doesn't, and therefore the U.S. has the right to protect its national security, as China does when it invokes those steps as well. I think actually what you're hearing now in the United States is great concerns about China's continued expansion of national security as it applies to economic data or scholarly data with, for example, the CNKI database, or the revisions to the counter-espionage law, in which they say, all documents, data, materials, and articles concerning national security and interests fall within the purview of that law, making it very difficult for people to understand when you go to China what is okay to do research on and what's not okay. And so that's a chilling of the relationship, a potential knowledge decoupling, which I think most people would think we'd want to avoid if at all possible. We have to have dialogue and communication directly with each other to stabilize the relationship, let alone improve it.
Mm-hmm. Well, recently we have seen, probably a little bit, or the start of thawing of relationship between the two countries. We see the approval of more Chinese flights, back and forth from China to the U.S., and also the recent meeting between the U.S. ambassador to China and Chinese foreign minister. Anyway, people say this is a good start. What do you see? The start of something probably more positive?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think we have to understand there are genuine differences between the two countries. Our political systems, our interests in certain areas, in some ways, our long-term visions for what the international order should look like. But for 50 plus years, we've figured out how to manage those differences in a relatively stable, peaceful way. We need to be able to continue to do that, even as China becomes more powerful and tries to have the world adopt some of its vision for international institutions. We don't agree on everything, but can we find a way to agree to disagree and also manage some of those differences in a more balanced way? I hope that these initial signs of thawing grow. I wrote a report with a colleague from Peking University called Breaking the Ice. And a point that he made is that the piece of ice that we tried to break may be the tip of a very large iceberg that we can't see fully. So there is a lot of work to be done. 3 years of no direct communication, very little communication, even in the last few months. We have a long way to go to try and form a stable relationship that's going to have to depend on officials at the top, middle, lower levels, scholars, business people, nonprofit organizations, media. It'd really help, in fact, if American journalists could go back to China to do their job, to report on China. I think that would increase trust from the United States quite a bit if we could have more journalists back on the ground doing their job. Maybe that would be one of the types of agreements that could be achieved, in addition to adding more flights, hopefully making them cheaper, and making it possible for people to travel back and forth for work, for their families, for vacation. Those things would be a good start.
Mm-hmm. In the recent report, you also mentioned the report, you worked with your Chinese colleague, entitled Breaking the Ice. You studied both U.S. and Chinese views about the bilateral relationship. I mention this because, this national sentiment is important sometimes in terms of affecting this relationship or the direction of the relationship. For example, in the U.S., this strong sentiment, let's say, or hostility even against China, I guess, is affecting Biden administration in terms of what they can do, despite what they want to do. So, what's the most significant differences probably you see between the views of the two sides, or because of the differences of the cultures? Is there a way, long-term way probably for people from both sides, by talking to each other, by getting rid of this misinformation or misperception sometimes, so we can build a long-term, more stable relationship here?
What I noticed when I was in China, and what sometimes you'll feel in the United States, is this lack of sense of confidence in oneself and about the future, and great fears about the future. China is now richer, stronger, healthier, safer than ever before. The chances of China being invaded or someone undermining the Chinese government is essentially zero. China should be celebrating the successes it has. Instead, China sounds like it's under siege. In Washington, you also get this sense of doom and crisis, internal crisis, international crisis. But the US has 3.5% unemployment, actually relatively strong growth. We have inflation, but that is really cyclical. We have major scientific achievements, a wonderful university and research system. We both have reasons to celebrate, yet we're both acting like we're very fearful, with the others playing a significant role. American public opinion, which is really worried and negative on China right now, I think actually it's relatively superficial level of worry. Even though 85% of Americans say they hold China in a negative light, I think they rank the China question relatively low in their level of hierarchy compared to crime, the economy, other issues. And when I was in China, people said, when you go, you're going to encounter anti-Americanism everywhere you went. I did not. I certainly found a lot of people that disagreed with me, but they weren't disagreeable. And in fact, I think people still admire a lot about the United States, even if they disagree with a lot of policies adopted in Washington, D.C. So I still think that there's significant goodwill amongst the peoples of both countries. If we could get the two capitals to figure out how to manage their differences, modify some of their policies, and I think Beijing has as much responsibility as Washington to make these modifications. I think we can find some ways to stabilize the relationship. I am pessimistic about our ability to do that, but I'm not fatalistic. And so I think it's still worth people in both sides giving it an effort.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, in that respect, like a people-to-people exchange, for example, more students probably studying in both countries, and of course, tourists visiting both countries, business investment in both countries, will that help stabilize the relationship and increase understanding, even the goodwill toward each other?
If we didn't have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Chinese students who had come to school in the United States, many who stayed and worked in the United States, made families here, engaged in business back and forth across the Pacific, if we didn't have collaborative R&D and business relationships, if we didn't have millions of Americans traveling to China and tens of thousands of Americans studying Chinese, living and working in China, if we didn't have all of that over the last 40 plus years, we already would have probably had some sort of very serious conflict. The people-to-people level of connectivity, economic interdependence has been a stabilizer in the relationship already. We already are benefiting from that, but it doesn't eliminate problems. It doesn't guarantee peace. We have some very serious differences. We've had 3 years of very little connectivity, and the problems have grown during that time. And many in Washington are assuming the worst in Beijing, and many in Beijing are assuming the worst about Washington. So there's a lot of work. We have to get people traveling back and forth. We have to figure out how to get some small victories and focus on some big problems at the same time. I think this is obviously, even though we're talking about the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, European countries, the EU, and others in Asia have very strong views on many of these issues and deserve a seat at the table as well. And so I think if you look at the speeches by the current president of the EU, as well as leaders elsewhere in Asia, we just recently hosted the president of the Philippines. There is a chorus for us to figure out how to solve and at least manage these problems in a responsible way. So I think the call for action has been made by many. It's time for us to get up and get some things accomplished.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for talking to us.
If we want to define the situation at the moment, go for the de-risk side, not the decoupling side. We have, yes, competition, but that we don't go into conflict and that we focus on cooperation. Trade is good. Now, my personal thesis is that we will not necessarily witness deglobalization, but we will witness a regionalization of globalization.
Well, welcome to the show, Mr. Stubb. In the recent meeting you joined, you talked about EU-China relationship. You talked about basically U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's recent speech on economic relationship with China, which should be a constructive one, which should be a healthy one. You said that EU should certainly de-risk relations with China, but decoupling from China is, quote, too big a mistake. So what do you make of this, like the differences between de-risking and decoupling? Where is the fine line?
Well, it's probably cooperation. And I guess my starting point is very simple. I think the Chinese economy and many Western economies, including the European Union and the United States, are so interdependent and dependent upon each other that full decoupling is a bad idea. There's a lot of strong rhetoric coming from the United States, to a certain extent from Europe as well. I would say that if we want to define the situation at the moment, go for the de-risk side, not the decoupling side. I know that we have differences when it comes to ideology. Europeans call us rival. At the same time, we have a lot of similarities when it comes to cooperation. So let's try to find a comfortable middle way. There's no point in escalating things further.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, recently the U.S. has somewhat changed its attitudes, with officials one after the other calling, decoupling would be a disaster for both economies. And they are also emphasizing their policies to de-risk. But do you think the de-risk, this phrase for the U.S. is the same for the European countries?
Well, it depends. Remember that the European Union has 27 member states. So you're probably going to have 27 twists of de-risking. And then, of course, the United States, the same thing. But it's always good to remind everyone that it takes two to tango, or perhaps in this case, three. In other words, China needs to de-risk with the United States and Europe and the United States need to de-risk with China. So we need to find a comfortable middle ground here. That's what de-risking is all about. I think for Europeans, and this is important to understand in China, a lot of it is linked to strategic technology. So we have a different perception on how we use data. In China, it is collective, it is state-based, and it's centralized. In the United States, it's with the private sector and consent is given by the individual, whereas in Europe, it's very much in the hands of the individual. So therefore, I think strategic technology is the area where we will probably see a lot of, not protectionist measures, but bringing things home.
Are you suggesting that probably, the three sides, they should talk to each other in terms of like, okay, their own version of de-risking, basically like how far we will go, because if we go too far, that means decoupling, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and this is what we have to understand. There's an ebb and flow in international relations and in globalization. China has benefited immensely from the rules-based world order, which has created the capacity for globalization. That is the way in which China has emerged as one of the greatest powers in this century. It is on par economically with the United States and with the European Union. So my message to China is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the same message comes to Europe and the United States. Our societies are based on free and open entrepreneurship. It is based on trade. It is based on globalization. And there are a lot of global goods where we need cooperation. Climate change, technology, demography, for instance. So I understand big power rivalry. I'm writing a book about it at the moment. But all I'm trying to say as a Finn is, calm down, we'll sort it out.
A great point you made, Mr. Stubb, globalization. It seems like there's people would say withdrawal of globalization or deglobalization even. But the Chinese side have stressed that, just as you said, they benefited massively from globalization, and they're trying to push for more globalization or otherwise regionalization, more free trade, more investment. But still, you see the force, the rising force against globalization, right?
Yeah, definitely. There is this sentiment that, globalization didn't work for everyone. Remember when the Cold War ended, Francis Fukuyama had a thesis about the end of history. Well, end of history didn't happen. I remember watching President Xi Jinping's speech at Davos in 2017, right when Donald Trump, Mr. America First, had been elected into power. And that speech was all about the benefits of globalization and trade and the importance of the fight against climate change. I think we need to come back, to that spirit and understand that trade is good. Now, my personal thesis is that we will not necessarily witness deglobalization, but we will witness a regionalization of globalization, which basically means that a lot of the value chains that used to be split around the world will be a little bit closer to home. So instead of seeing one world order, we'll probably see multiple orders, one around Asia, one around Europe, one around North America, one around Latin America, one around Africa. Of course, this is a simplification, but I think it's the responsibility of the big players like China, like the United States, like the European Union, or for instance, like India, to make sure that we have this sort of strategic management, that we have, yes, competition, but that we don't go into conflict and that we focus on cooperation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Stubb. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.